Hello, and welcome to Afternoon Tea with Karen. Let's get into a bit of eco-socialism.
Thanks very much for your patience. So, look, Rising Tide is aiming to build a mass movement, right? And that's a pretty ambitious goal. For those of you who might not be aware, our stated aim is to build up to a group of people, 10,000 strong or more, who are committing to taking disruptive action, ongoing disruptive action at the Port of Newcastle, right? And as introduced, I am from Newcastle. It is the world's largest coal port, and what we produce accounts for about 1% of total global carbon emissions, which is an insane amount of fossil fuel emissions to come from one small, reasonably small regional town in New South Wales, right? So what we have in Newcastle is a place-based campaign, centered around this really critical target. So what Rising Tide is aiming to do is to build up a campaign of people who are committing to taking disruptive action on an ongoing basis. Now, Blockade Australia has done an amazing job disrupting the profits and disrupting the infrastructure, the trains that go into the Port of Newcastle. But at a certain point, at least it's my perspective, disruptive protest acts more as political theatre, right? When you don't have the power to shut down a piece of industry or to disrupt a politician for more than a couple of days at a time, that's very impressive, but it's not leverage because the state knows that they can police and remove those activists and get the system rolling again, right? What they can't do, and they can't do that, they can't police the problem away if we're talking about thousands of people, boots on the ground, blockade camps, rolling waves of disruption. In my ideal scenario, solidarity strikes or other industrial actions by unions. That's a fair way off and another conversation. But there's more to disruption than just getting on a coal train track and stopping the industry for a couple of days. To build up to that point, to build that momentum, and to make the case, I guess, in the Australian public that disruptive action is a legitimate and effective method of political engagement is our challenge, right? And so to build that sort of momentum, Rising Tide has attempted to tell a story. Because, as you know, the news doesn't report facts, it reports stories. People don't think in facts, they think in stories, and they think in narratives where typically they want to be the good guy. So to tell that sort of narrative, a narrative of collective empowerment, a narrative of taking on the fossil fuel industry for a collective aim. A sense of momentum is really important. So we've designed actions in a way like the People's Blockade last year, where we got 3,000 people on the ground in Newcastle to stop coal ships for 30 hours, designed actions in a way that seem accessible to the majority of everyday Australians who are extremely concerned about the climate crisis and know that the governments aren't doing enough. In fact, not only not doing enough, but approving new coal and gas projects, to line the coffers of their mates in the corporate world. To make these sort of actions accessible, we have made our messaging, as broadly appealing as possible, I think. Our demands being, no new coal and gas, a tax on corporations, on fossil fuel corporations to fund transition, and ultimately the end of fossil fuel exports by 2030. So, I'm terribly sorry, I'm still getting distracted by myself. But I appreciate being in such good company that I'm sure you won't hold it against me. And I, again, regret that I can't be there in person. We've tried to build this story, right, of everyday people standing up in a disruptive capacity in a way that targets the problem. World's largest coal port, the corporations that run it, not the workers, but the corporations that run it for profit. That's a story that we want people to identify with. And so bringing in everyday folks off the street who haven't engaged in activism before, this may be their first action, this may be their first foray into any sort of protest, let alone direct action. We want to make it participatory, engaging, and a positive experience, which leads to some, operational considerations on the ground in terms of how we engage with police, for example, how we align our messaging. So participant experience and accessibility is a really important element. We operate with a couple of key strategic frameworks, right? One being momentum organizing, sequences of escalatory actions followed up by absorption that sort of build up interest, build up excitement for the project, and then invite people to come into our circles and participate and grow together. Through that sort of escalation and absorption, we've grown from a group of about 6 people in Newcastle 18 months ago to a genuinely national group with hubs in all of the East Coast capitals, the Northern Rivers, Central Victoria, and more. And in fact, the Rising Tide team is now going around the country on a national tour around the East Coast. I apologise that it doesn't include Western Australia. And that's part of the reason why I may seem underprepared. We are giving it a red hot go, right? Like our folks, including myself, have been all around the country doing actions, town hall events, trainings, and trying to keep up as big of a media presence as possible to absorb people in and to invite them to participate in the next Blockade, which is going to happen this November again for 10 days with 10,000 people. Momentum is really important. To make our actions accessible, we again try to present a very citizen-y face and as open sort of messaging as possible. And of course, disruptive direct action is at this point, at the scale that we're at, as far as I'm considered, political theatre, signalling both to the government that if they don't get their shit together, we're going to keep building a campaign that does have the potential to disrupt this piece of industry on an ongoing basis, but also, presenting this argument to people who do participate, who do have positive experiences, who might know someone who was arrested, that this method of political engagement is legitimate. It's civil resistance is what won, the 8-hour workday. It's what won women's suffrage. It's what's won civil rights for a whole bunch of marginalised folks in Australia and around the world. And it's something that we need to do again to tackle a crisis that is at the scale that we find ourselves in. That's the basic pitch, right? And I've gone on a long ramble, but I want to also make it quite clear that we see the movement as being an ecosystem, right? And Rising Tide has a very specific role to play in that ecosystem. It's not the vehicle that's going to win by itself. And I think everyone in this room would be, would share that view. If there's one thing that I would like Rising Tide to leave as a legacy to the Australian sort of political movement and the left, is an experience of a really strong campaign that makes mass disruptive actions, puts mass disruptive actions back on the menu, I guess, back on the menu of the left, gives people, hopefully thousands of people, a positive experience of participating in them. Hopefully win some concessions out of government and starts to set an agenda for what is and is not appropriate climate action. Hint, new coal and gas is not appropriate climate action. It's not as revolutionary as it needs to be. It's not as complete as it needs to be. It's a first step, and that's what I'd like to leave on.
Thanks very much, Zach.
Thanks very much, Zach. So, Rising Tide. I'm going to start off with something in more, seeing we've just come from the socialists. The future is renewable. Yes to wind power. Offshore wind development from Norway, Denmark, Spain and France have expressed interest in building Newcastle's offshore wind future. We stand in solidarity with groups such as the Maritime Union of Australia, Electrical Trades Union and the Australian Manufacturers Working Union in calling the government to ensure renewable energy jobs are provided secure union employment. Join us at 2024 People's Blockade of the world's largest coal port. Time is short and the stakes could not be higher. Australia's fossil fuel addiction is driving the world to the brink. And Zach has already told us about us and a bit about the story. So listen and support First Nations people who resist coal and gas mining on their lands. And we must unite with school kids and communities around the world to light the climate justice against the suicidal agenda of a few dozen fossil fuel executives. Okay, so they haven't heard of BlackRock. We need to use our greatest superpower, civil resistance. Our demands tax fossil fuel export profits at 75% to fund communities and industrial transition and pay for climate loss and damage. Except for number 1 is immediately cancel all new fossil fuel projects. And they want to end all coal exports from Newcastle by 2030. So what, for 6 years you're going to charge people 75% of their profits? Anyway. Rising tide has now restarted and there is an urgent need for our type of radical but targeted and inclusive climate action. So there they are all in their plastic boats. Right, our values, climate defence pledge. They've got 1,926 people have pledged for the this. The People's Blockade. Come for an hour, come for 10 days. Tuesday, November the 19th till Thursday, November the 28th. Strap yourself in. This year it will be more than 3 times the scale, 10,000 people over 10 days. So they're just 8,074 people short. It's all right, they've got till November. So there's a 10-day plan if you'd like to do that for your annual leave. People's Blockade 2024 will be groundbreaking, 10,000 people over 10 days. From Newcastle, we'll head straight to Parliament House in Canberra to demand PM answer, when will you stop new coal and gas? Book your accommodation early, sort out your travel arrangements, and that'll do with that page. So let's check out their merch. We can get a t-shirt, some earrings, a badge, some stickers, and you can give them $5 a month. So Rising Tide Youth. And we've got mostly girls and we've got SS4C. School Strikes for Climate. Follow us on Instagram. And SS4C became Youth Rising. So SS4C, I know them because they are supporters of Make It 16, which is part of the Labor Party. It's the Young Labor, and they've got a campaign to change the voting age to 16. So they're campaigning the government, even though they're Young Labor themselves. And also the Greens want to change the voting age to 16. Anyway, I'm digressing.
I've had a lot of people, young people from my area, young people in my class, in my own class, wanting reform.
All I can say is that everyone I spoke to around my age have voted for, well, if they could, they would have voted for Reform UK. There's not been people for the opposition.
Wow.
So that's a high percentage.
Absolutely, a lot of people. I'd say about 90%. Well, there's a clear difference actually. Men and women, right? more men, I'd say about 90% of the men in my school would want to vote for reform, right? We've had mock elections coming up, and most of the men are going for reform. Most of the women are going for the Greens, the Lib Dems, the Workers' Party, the pro-Palestine bunch. If you describe them as that, what sort of
And that'll do. See you later. Bye.